Starvation and death. The UN has issued one of its grimmest warnings yet. It says Yemen could face a famine never before seen. But what can world leaders do to stop such a catastrophe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Millions will die. That is the stark warning from the United Nations humanitarian chief over the crisis in Yemen. Out of sight and out of mind for most of the world. Millions of children, mothers and fathers are struggling to find food. Now the UN warns Yemen could face the largest famine the world has seen for many decades. It's urging the Saudi-led coalition to end its devastating blockade and allow aid into the country. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first this report from Jamjoon.
At Sana'a International Airport, an ominous silence. Terminals are as empty of people as runways are devoid of planes. Clear signs that the crisis in Yemen is only growing more dire.
Sana'a International Airport was completely brought to a halt by the warring coalition states that included preventing the UN aeroplanes, humanitarian aid, the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders.
But airport officials aren't just angry with the parties to the conflict.
The United Nations could have taken brave and clear decisions to condemn the aggression. The UN could have compelled the belligerent states to allow at least humanitarian aid to arrive and to allow access to the injured, casualties and humanitarian cases.
For its part, the UN has warned that in Yemen, which is in the grips of a cholera epidemic that has seen more than 900,000 suspected cases since April, is also facing the world's worst famine crisis. One that could kill millions of people unless the Saudi-led military coalition ends its blockade and allows aid to flow into the country. Saudi Arabia imposed a land and sea blockade in Yemen after a ballistic missile was fired on Saturday towards its capital, Riyadh. Since then, it has only become more difficult for citizens to get their hands on vital commodities, with prices of petrol and cooking oil rising drastically. In the port city of Hodeidah, humanitarian access was already difficult for aid agencies. Now, it's only got worse.
Insofar as closing down the ports and borders, these are war crimes in the first degree.
At the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Sana'a, officials are extremely concerned of what will happen if they can't continue to bring food into the country.
You know that Yemen is the largest food insecurity crisis all over the world. Every month we feed 7 million people. These are people who depend completely on relief aid for their survival, and we import these commodities, the food, to help these people.
Which is why the longer Yemen's air and seaports sit empty, the longer the suffering will continue. Jamjoon, Jazeera.
So let's take a closer look at the situation in Yemen. It is the Arab world's poorest country, and while the Houthis and the Yemeni government have been fighting for years, the Saudi-led military campaign began in 2015. Since then, the situation has deteriorated for the almost 21 million Yemenis that the UN estimates are in need of assistance. The conflict has killed more than 10,000 people and left another 7 million without adequate food, health, water and sanitation. Yemen has also been hit with one of the worst cholera outbreaks in recent memory, with some 900,000 suspected cases since April. Let's go straight to our guests. Joining on Skype from Chicago, Akshaya Kumar, Deputy United Nations Director for Human Rights Watch. In Sana'a, Hussein al-Bughaiti, Yemeni journalist and former editor of News of Yemen website. And Oxford, Helen Lackner, author of Yemeni Crisis, The Transformation of Tribal Roles in Recent Decades. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Hassan al-Bughaiti, Yemen is facing what could possibly be the largest famine in decades. It's a horrific title to earn, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, and I'm not surprised to hear that because of 3 years of the Saudi-led coalition war and tight blockade, which they have actually extended to close all airport and border crossing in their area as well, which many Yemenis use to use it as a travel as well. Some of the food that used to come into Yemen come of this border crossing. And it's not only this situation, we had as well this cholera, which the UN, I think is the UNICEF have said is one of the largest cholera outbreaks since the record began. And the latest extension of the blockade actually has doubled the price of fuel, and the price of food has increased 40 to 60%. And I think that the Saudi and their blockade is not actually affecting Ansarullah, also known the Houthi, and as they call the Saleh forces, because we have seen the latest missile attack on Saudi capital city shows that this blockade and 3 years of the Saudi strikes has not actually damaged the Houthi military capacity. Every time they have improved, and they have proven that they can reach deeper area into Saudi. And I think that these latest, when they tied in this blockade, this means that the crisis and the food crisis, fuel crisis, and cholera and the starvation of the Yemeni will only increase on the poor people of Yemen, and it will not affect the Houthis, because they know how they can improve their military capacity, and the 3 years of war has not actually affected them. And on the top of that, we've seen that the Saudi actually has released a list of 40 Houthi commanders that they said they want to kill, and they have put a bounty hunt on them. They have spent $200 billion, actually, as they say, to stop these people. And now at the
we'll
end,
talk
after
about that a
3
little
years
bit later.
of war,
I just want to focus on the humanitarian situation right now, if I may. Akshaya, Kumar, I mean, these dire warnings about a dire situation in a country that has suffered for so much for so long. Tell us what you are hearing, what you are seeing on the ground.
Well, Human Rights Watch actually can't get to the ground because of the Saudi restrictions. There have been restrictions that prevent independent journalists or groups like ours from getting there, because we tell the truth, we look at the facts, and we report them with neutrality and impartiality. But what I can say is that we've seen very slow action at the UN Security Council in particular to challenge the Saudis for these restrictions, for this now almost total blockade, and for blocking and obstructing humanitarian aid. We don't just need to complain or throw our hands up in despair and say millions will suffer, a famine could happen. The UN has the power to impose consequences on those individuals who are actually making the decisions and who are responsible for obstructing the aid that is preventing needy people from getting the assistance they require.
From a human rights watch point of view, what sort of atrocities are you seeing? What sort of impact is it having on innocent people? Then, are we seeing a war crime being committed here?
Exactly. So the laws of war don't forbid the Saudis from taking the step that they've taken, which is a blockade. But they do restrict the ways that the blockade is conducted. And in that, what we're seeing are really disturbing signs. You're not supposed to impose a blockade if it imposes a disproportionate impact on civilians against the military advantage that you would get. And here, the impact on civilians is massive. You have millions who were relying on the UN for aid and assistance, and now the UN is completely shut out. Other humanitarian partners are also shut out. And so for us, there just isn't any proportionality. You can't claim that the benefit you get is justified by the harm being inflicted on these innocent and needy people in Yemen. And that's where it crosses the line from just being horrible to also being something that should be condemned as against the law. And once you do that, there should be consequences, including at the Security Council, which has the power to sanction people.
Helen Lackner, you know the country very well. You've written about it. Does it surprise you that we are seeing these sort of atrocities now, the level of atrocities, the levels of suffering?
To answer your question, no, I can't say that one can be so surprised. And I think, you know, the UN system is very much caught up in a very difficult situation, partly, well, primarily because of the United Nations Resolution 2216, which has been the justification for the Saudi-led intervention. And this has meant that, you know, it's very difficult for the UN to take, at the political level, to take a very open position against the activities of the Saudi-led coalition, because the Saudi-led coalition is actually supposedly implementing or attempting to implement what has been requested by the resolution, which is to put back in power President Hadi, who was elected for an interim position for 2 years in 2012.
I mean, you would think there would be limitations in how you can do such a thing.
No, I totally agree that the situation is very disastrous for the population. And I think, to me, you know, all sides in this war are guilty of war crimes, and all sides in this war are behaving in a totally inhumane manner, because although there's a very small leadership on all sides who are benefiting from the current situation, the result is precisely what you mentioned earlier, which is the likelihood of 7 million people possibly dying and, you know, another 20 million suffering on a daily basis, increasingly atrocious conditions, with no water, you know, inadequate food, no means of earning an income. You know, all the basic necessities of ordinary life are basically denied to the population. The medical services aren't there, which is why the cholera has managed to expand at such speed and in this unprecedented manner. So I'm not in any, you know, basically my view is that on all sides in this war, the leadership are guilty of anything you care to accuse them of.
Hussein, what is your response to that all leaders are guilty of what we are seeing on the ground, whether it be the Houthi leaders, the Saudi-led coalition, Al-Qaeda there, possibly some of the tribes, that everybody possibly in a grim way is benefiting from this?
If we see, the most blame must be towards the Saudi. I mean, the Saudi was the point of having blockade and was the point of delaying UN ship and NGOs shipment coming into Yemen, either to Hodeidah or to Sana'a airport. I mean, I don't think that a Scud missile will be supplied to the Houthi by a UN flight.
No, I mean, nobody's doubting that.
Ship.
But what about the Houthi role? What about the Houthi role in this? I mean, their hands are not clean. The way they use human shields, for example, the way they infiltrate busy areas. I mean, you know, they are also accountable for many of the atrocities that we are seeing on the ground. We have to acknowledge that before we can move on.
No, I mean, the blame that maybe will put on the Saudi is what they called the coup that they have done into Yemen. They seize power, of course, yeah, we know that. But, I mean, this happened in many countries. But this does not give you a reason or the right to launch a war on a country and to have a blockade, and at the end to say, oh, Scud missiles still are supplied into the Houthis. So what's the point of all this blockade? It means those 14 millions of people who are starving is the fault of the Saudi blockade. I mean, there was a coup in Egypt. What have they done into it? No, this is an internal matter. And if there was no blockade and war, Yemen will be exactly the same as it was between 2014 and September 2014 and as well March 2015. 6 months, the Houthi were in power. There was no starvation. There was, I mean, no fuel shortages, and everything was fine. Either you agree with the Houthi as they call it the coup, or you don't. The main reason of this is the Saudi blockade into Yemen.
It's been a country that has suffered from starvation and humanitarian atrocities for a very long time. Akshaya, I just want to bring you in here. I mean, we've got all of these players, and everybody has a small or a big role in what we're seeing unfolding on the ground. And I'm just wondering how this is going to be put to an end. I mean, we see these horrific pictures of starving children crawling on the ground with absolutely nothing to eat. And you saying that from a United Nations security point of view, we can't find some sort of resolution to put a stop to this. So where will it end?
Look, there are two parts of it. One is it's not just the Saudi-led coalition that's responsible for abuses, although they are responsible for airstrikes and for this obstruction of aid. It's also the Houthis. And to solve it, then, we need to address the crimes of both sides here. The Houthis have also obstructed aid. They have shelled indiscriminately. They have used sites where civilians are as human shields, as you mentioned. And so both sides' atrocities, both sides' crimes need need to be confronted. One way to do that is to use sanctions on an equal basis. Until now, sanctions have been imposed on one side of this conflict, but not on the other. So that's something for the Security Council to consider. The other bit, and I think this is really important because Yemenis have never had it, is some kind of opportunity for justice, some challenge to the climate of impunity, where anyone, whether it's the Saudi-led coalition or the Houthis, can really get away with murder without much of a consequence. And the good news is that the UN has created a body which can find the facts. There's supposed to be some eminent people appointed by the UN High Commissioner, Prince Zaid, shortly, who would be able to investigate and determine what happened and identify who's responsible, so that maybe one day victims will have a chance to have their stories heard in court and some kind of justice. Because without acknowledging all of those responsible for committing crimes, Yemen will never be able to move forward in a sustainable and durable fashion.
And that's certainly looking forward in the future, whoever, whenever that might be, Helen, because that would mean that there'd have to be some sort of rule of law in the country. And I mean, I know you've studied tribes in particular there and the different players. How do you see it coming out from a ground point of view? Where will the retribution happen from there, the reconciliation?
Well, first I'd like to agree with absolutely everything the Human Rights Watch person has just said. I mean, all those points are extremely important and they need to be carried out. In the long run, I think we have a situation where not only do we have the Saudi-led coalition, a large, very important external intervention, which is worsening the crisis very dramatically. But we also have very serious internal differences within Yemen. It was reaching to a civil war situation, regardless of the presence of the intervention of the coalition. So I think that's one very important element to look at. The next element to look at is, of course, that the situation at the moment is officially, when you are talking about the Saudi-led coalition with the internationally recognized government fighting the Houthi-Saleh alliance. Now, these are not the only parties involved in Yemen. Inside the country, there are many, many other parties, ranging from tribes to the southern separatists, to a whole load of different groups, including jihadis. And if any peace is going to be reached in the long run, what is absolutely essential is to start doing this from the base upwards, to start creating confidence, to start creating institutions at the community level, at the village level, at the district level, situations which are going to be able to eventually create a new Yemeni polity in which you have a much more you can build a kind of democracy, and you can certainly build a regime which would focus on the needs of the people. I think what's been very apparent for the last decades or so is that those people who have ruled the country and those people who have made decisions in the country have all had concerns which were not the welfare of the majority of the population. They were primarily concerned with their own private interests, as is the case in so many other regimes.
It's very difficult, I should imagine, isn't it, when generations are being wiped out, or you've got malnourished children, which obviously impacts generations, it impacts people for decades to come. And Hussein, I'm just wondering what sort of resolutions are in play, if we pick up on what Helen said, to try and put an end to this from the Houthi point of view, considering that we've just seen a strike on Saudi Arabia, which you mentioned earlier on in the programme. How is that going to help resolve the situation? Doesn't it just exacerbate it and prolong what we are seeing, the proxy war that we're seeing in Yemen?
Maybe this launch of the missile, it would not solve the problem, but at least it could actually show the Saudi, or make the Saudi taste some of what they have been doing into Yemen 3 years. Many people, of course, they condemn that and they say what it will bring, but this is war. I mean, you are fighting the Houthi, so you should expect they will fight you back. I mean, they're not going to just stand and watch. And we've seen that all this humanitarian crisis that's happening in Yemen, most of the pressure, sometimes, especially from the UN envoy into Yemen, it comes on the Houthi. They have used the cholera outbreak and asking the Houthi to withdraw from Hodeidah and to hand over Hodeidah. So they're trying to use this crisis, or especially of cholera as a military goal or gain for the Saudi. We can actually, if we see the outbreak of the cholera and the starvation, it's happening, for example, mostly in Hodeidah and in Hajjah, and those areas there is no war there. So it means it's not because of the war inside, it's not because the Houthis, not because of Saleh forces, it's because the blockade and the strikes that targeting market and the targeting hospitals, roads, water station. So, and it's simple, really simple to fight all this. The Yemeni people need fuel and they need food. Fuel to get clean water, and you can fight cholera, and food to stop the starvation and malnutrition. And it's 100%, the blame on this is 100% on the Saudi-led coalition and on their blockade, and as well on the UN envoy to Yemen, who has not actually mentioned the Saudi in one of his single report or statement. He always called it a civil war.
Can I just bring Akshaya? I'm just wondering what the recent developments in Saudi Arabia, the impact of that is having on conversations at the UN. I mean, considering how muted the response has been to the latest attacks in Yemen and Donald Trump's support for what we've been seeing in Saudi Arabia, how is that going to help or hinder developments at the moment?
Look, the geopolitics of this are quite difficult, and the Houthis didn't help matters by attacking a civilian airport in Riyadh. Of course, you can fight a war, but you cannot fight a war by attacking civilians. In fact, this is what Yemenis are complaining about. This is what they accuse the Saudi-led coalition of doing. So it's quite ironic that they would break those same rules when they try to fight against the Saudis and go against civilians inside Riyadh. So this adds just to the broader situation where you have a perception of the Saudis consolidating their support. You mentioned Donald Trump, who has bragged that he plans on selling more weapons to the Saudis, which he argues would generate American jobs, without recognizing, of course, that by selling those weapons, he's connecting the U.S. economy and those jobs to the carnage which is ongoing in Saudi Arabia. There's a very robust conversation in the UK about why it would be illegal to continue to sell weapons to a country that is leading a coalition that continues to violate the laws of war and commit war crimes. And yet, ironically,
sorry, let me just bring Helen in very quickly. It's not looking good, is it? I mean, do you have a timeline for this country, for it to see some sort of light, some sort of rebirth, if possible?
Well, first I'd like to pick up the point you made earlier about, starvation and the jeopardizing of the future of children and families starving. I think, that is a very important point and something that we all need to look at and examine. I think the timeline at the moment is extremely difficult to envisage. I haven't met anyone who is envisaging an immediate end to the war. I think there are too many factors that are preventing it from ending. I mean, first you have the issue that was just raised of the Iranian-Saudi proxy war, which is really nothing to do with Yemen in reality, but in practice is being fought out partly in Yemen. You have the issue, of course, of Trump's support for the Saudis, a completely indiscriminate support, regardless of any facts or any other factors. You have the fact that both factions or both groups still think they can win this war, even though the evidence from the past 2 years strongly suggests that this is not the case. And as mentioned earlier, you have the issue of the profiteering. And I think, it is really shocking and shameful that you have so many so few people who are managing to allow the starvation and dying and suffering of more than 27 million people in such a completely ruthless manner and totally regardless of any humanitarian feelings. I mean, I don't find the right words to really express the anger and the frustration that so many people I know experience in Yemen and outside. You know, it is a really shocking situation, and there should be shame.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Helen, Lackner, thank you very much. Hussein al-Baghaiti and Akshaya, Kumar, very good to get your comments on this. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Jane Dutton, the rest of the team, goodbye.